Welcome to the Mitchell Hamline Law Journal of Public Policy and Practice podcast, brought to you by the student-run and student-edited journal at Mitchell Hamline School of Law. Founded in 1976, our journal is dedicated to excellence through diligence, not exclusivity. And now we're thrilled to bring that mission to the airwaves. My name is Maggie, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal.
And I'm Ashley, the public policy editor. Today, we start off our first episode with Professor Jason Mirasam. How are you doing, Professor?
Great. Happy to be here. Excited. First episode.
We're really excited to have you. Thank you for being here, Professor.
For sure.
So, give us the breakdown. What did you do before teaching, and how did you end up getting into election law?
Okay. So I got into election law in a couple ways. First, many years ago, when I was in law school, I took a seminar on legal history and ended up, for that class, writing a paper on the 1918 election and election law in that election, which was the first election at the time held during a pandemic. So that was when I was a law student. And I took election law with the late, great Lonnie Guinier, who was a giant in the field as well. So I was always interested in it. And then wrote that paper and actually got the paper published, but didn't think much about it until fast forward to 2019, 2020. I was at the Minnesota Attorney General's office, and I started to get involved in a lot of election and voting cases for the state of Minnesota during the 2020 election. At the same time, as we all know, we had a pandemic, and this article that I'd written many years ago turned out to have been the only one that was about how we held an election during a pandemic. So that got resurfaced. And then I'm sort of a busy litigator at that time doing, I lost count, 8, 9, 10 plus election law cases in 2020 for the state of Minnesota, sort of practicing in that area. Really fell in love with it. And then when I came to teaching at Mitchell Hamline, I've sort of stayed writing and teaching in that field of election law and voting rights.
Wow. Well, so can you walk us through just some of the foundational principles behind election laws? Like, how would you describe it for someone who just isn't familiar with the field?
Sure. I would say there's several principles. And of course, sometimes these principles are in tension and we don't always sort of live up to them, but they're sort of the lodestar principles. I'd say first, of course, is the right to vote. We have this idea of universal suffrage for all citizens who are 18 or older, regardless of race, sex, religion. It's the universal suffrage principle. We have a principle of one person, one vote, which means at its ideal, every person's vote carries the same weight, carries equal weight as the one person, one vote principle. And we also have principles of accessibility. We don't want it to be too hard to vote. At the same time, we have a principle of security and integrity. Each ballot should be counted in accordance with the voters' will. Now, like I said, sometimes they're in tension and they're trade-offs. Someone might say, hey, the easier we make it to vote, the less secure the ballots are, that we can't perfectly optimize both of those values. Or think about the one person, one vote. We've never sort of purely lived to that principle when you think of things like the Senate, where not everyone, vote carries the same weight for electing the Senate or even in the Electoral College. But I'd say those are the major sort of lodestar principles in this field.
Wow.
So election law really has been plagued with stagnation. It's one of those legal topics that I feel like hasn't seen much growth as far as public policies go. Do you think that this is because it's just not a topic that the legal community focuses on, or does it stem from an ideological divide, or is my conception incorrect?
Well, I would say two things there. One, I think it's partly incorrect, and I do think there's been significant changes, but I think the ideological divide is huge and is partly responsible for some of the changes that we've seen. So I would say starting in the 90s, but really accelerating with Bush v. Gore and then accelerating again in the past decade or so, we have seen massive changes at the state legislative level in terms of the content of election laws. I think if you go back in our nation's history, we had very much regional differences in election laws. New England's laws might look different than the Southwest. But what we've really seen, again, I'd say starting in the 90s, but accelerating after Bush v. Gore in the past decade, is a partisan shift. We're starting to see, not starting, we are seeing red state laws and blue state laws in terms of how they're balancing those principles, whether it's accessibility, security, and the kinds of laws that they're passing. Now, something that's really interesting, I mean, we have these ideological divides, but there's been some interesting research that suggests it's really outdated. The parties haven't updated their behavior to match their voter demographics. So we're seeing real shifts in that we're still seeing these patterns of behavior from the Republicans and Democrats when they control legislatures in certain states. But it's actually an interesting time to see, as we get shifting coalitions among the parties, whether they'll change their behavior and we'll enter a new era of election law. But there have been, and I'll say one other trend that has been huge in the past 25 years, the amount of litigation in election law has skyrocketed. Every election, we say, oh gosh, look at the levels. It can't possibly get higher. And it does. So every major election, we're seeing massive amounts of election law litigation across the country.
Do you think like the pandemic caused quite a bit of change when it came with, election laws?
There's certainly a lot of litigation around it, some legislation, a lot of litigation around that election in 2020. Voter behavior changed in a massive way, in that we saw there's always been some vote by mail, some states vote exclusively by mail. But of course, there was more of that during the pandemic, and certain habits can become sticky. People vote a certain way, they have certain routines. Maybe certain people on election day every 4 years, they're going to vote in the morning or they're going to vote in the evening. And then people who are voting by mail, that becomes part of their habits. So the numbers of voting by mail have gone down since the 2020 election, but it is still higher than it was pre-pandemic. And that tends to be more Democrats voting by mail than Republicans. So that can lead to polarized responses to how we think about vote by mail, depending on who's in power too.
Wow. I don't think I would have ever thought about that as like trends. I do kind of assume that people automatically want to do absentee ballots. I think that's such a, but hearing you talk about that, that's super interesting.
And one thing I'll say, it is absentee and voting by mail. It's an important part. And like I said, some states do it exclusively. And also, if you live out state, and it might be hard to get to the precinct, it is certainly a valuable option. But ballots are rejected at a higher rate than in person when you go to the in-person ballot. And it's just, there's so many more layers of, you got to sign the outside, you got to stuff it in the envelope in the right way. It's got to be looked at in the right way. So they are rejected at a higher rate, which, not an astronomical rate, but it is higher than if you vote in person at the precinct.
I have noticed, I feel like a trend where there's more, I think more states are trying to educate people on how to fill out those ballots, because I do think people automatically, it's like one of those things, like you get going and you just kind of use whatever marker you've got, thinking that that's going to be the easiest way to kind of get it done. And it ends up not. Do you think there'll be more laws kind of regulating absentee ballots? Because I do feel like we've maybe as a country have stopped wanting to do that, and we're maybe trending more towards using more technology.
Well, technology could be an answer here, but mail is still way more secure than, say, voting online. And we haven't yet mastered a way. So if you go back to those principles of accessibility, ideally you could have a system where you got just massive voter turnout, right? From a democratic principle of let's reflect the will of the electorate. If you could have massive turnout, if you could make it as easy as everyone got out their phone and you could actually track to make sure one person, one vote, and the integrity of that ballot was counted, and you can make it super easy. To me, that would be an ideal, but we're not there. But vote by mail, in some states that have gone to exclusively to vote by mail, they will send a ballot to every registered voter at the address where it's registered. So they do try to make it more accessible in that regard. So I'm not sure that we'll see less of it. We might even see more of it going forward. But at the same time, we are seeing there is a movement in some jurisdictions to go away from machine counting to hand counting, sort of go back to the olden days because maybe there's a distrust of the technology, all of this is really fast moving and dynamic and has a lot of its own trade-offs. I mean, you might think, gosh, the machines mess up. Well, you know who also messes up? Tired people counting ballots after ballot. Yeah, so no easy answers as we're trying to find a system. It's all the more complicated by the fact that we have a really super decentralized election system. The federal government is not running the show. It is the states and local election officials. So we have so many different election systems, different sets of election laws, different ways of voting, different hours for the polls, all these different things that spread out across the country. In some ways that can create experiments so we can see what works, that sort of old justification for federalism, but it also can make it really complicated.
Now,
Um,
I think Maggie had a great question about kind of on the line of technological trends.
yes. Professor, I think it's safe to say that in recent years, social media has really changed and influenced our elections. And I think we could go on to say that AI most likely will be affecting our elections as well. Um, how are these new technological trends challenging um, traditional election law frameworks?
Yeah, so we are seeing these technologies, and I think the biggest problem is an eroding public confidence in elections or electioneering of what voters can trust. So when you see, for example, we've seen fake social media accounts that are pushing content and disinformation. We've had deep fake robocalls purporting to be from candidates when they're not. And it is a problem both in terms of misinformation and disinformation that really can undermine public confidence in the elections and make voters not know what to trust. But it is really hard to regulate in a way that has teeth without raising First Amendment issues and really hard to enforce. I'm not sure that there are easy answers there. And now go back. It's not like, and I don't want to romanticize the olden days. I mean, there would be people, sometimes the parties, they'd send out flyers full of blatant lies that would go to houses. And this is a modern version of that, but it's just so much more pervasive in this era of an online world, a social media world, where you can have these images and you just don't know what to believe or not believe. You can have like a robocall that sounds exactly like that presidential candidate who but isn't, and playing on that is really hard for voters to discern and really hard to regulate. Now, there are going to be attempts to regulate it, but I'm not sure ultimately how successful they will be. These kinds of problems persist and can flare up in different times in our history.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that. I had recently watched listened to a podcast about kind of the history of how the language of kind of our politics have really changed and how that switch was made, and it was just super fascinating. Because I just think technology's really changed the way also how view elections. What do you think is kind of the most pressing unresolved question in election today?
From a purely like doctrinal point, the biggest, most pressing unresolved question is whether the Voting Rights Act has a private cause of action. There is a pending case that the Supreme Court might take up, Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa v. Howe, that is potentially raising this question, and it could have huge ramifications for voting rights and the litigation in this field. And so, just to give some background, you have the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and for decades, private individuals have sued to vindicate voting rights under theories of, say, racial vote dilution that, say, a state or say a local city has the way they've drawn their city council lines in a discriminatory way. And for decades that has been done and enforced to say, okay, yes, this city has drawn the lines in a way to minimize Black voter support. Say you have a city that is 30% Black, but they draw the line so they get 0 city council seats, just as an example. So the Voting Rights Act has been there to provide protections and allow that. Well, there's recently been a push to say, you know what? All those years we got it wrong, because the argument goes the Voting Rights Act doesn't actually have language that authorizes private individuals to bring suits to vindicate the voting rights, that it's only up to the U.S. Department of Justice. That's the only entity, person that can bring these suits. And so that case really it's pending. Don't know whether the Supreme Court will take it and hear argument, or what they would do there. But it could be earth-shattering to the field of voting rights. And I would say that is sort of the most pressing unresolved question right now.
Well, I didn't even know that case was going on, or that was being challenged at all. Um, are there any lessons to be drawn from policy approaches in other democracies, either on campaign finance or the voting system, or is America kind of leading the charge in that aspect?
No, there are for sure lessons. Now, hard. I mean, we have our own unique history of politics and what is sort of practical or achievable at a political lens. But definitely, I think there are other democracies on the campaign finance that do a better job. I mean, we have a system that is awash and with money on all sides that can distort our politics in a sense of not necessarily, and not saying outright bribery, although, I mean, of course, that can happen, has happened in history, but just of where campaigns are so expensive in this country, and the need to raise money from billionaires in order to fund those campaigns distorts what gets promised or delivered on in our politics. And so I think other countries that have more restrictions on that are a good example for us to potentially look at. The other piece is the districting, the gerrymandering. We have a system where if one state is controlled by one party, that party can draw they're in charge of drawing the district lines for Congress and the state legislature. And they can draw it in a way that maximizes their representation and minimizes the other party's representation. So you can have a state that is almost 50-50 Republican, Democrat, or slightly one or the other. But if one party gets control over the governor's office and the legislature, they can draw the lines in a way that might give them a supermajority of representation, in a way that is really not representative of the will of the people. I think it is one of the biggest problems in our democracy, and one that separates us and makes us worse, I think, off than other democracies that don't have those gerrymandering issues, either because they have a different system like proportional representation, or draw their districts in a more neutral rather than partisan way.
Now, do you think that's because that, a lot of these election laws, it's state kind of implementation wise, like you have this decentralization, like you said, that if we had more of a federal kind of oversight on it, or, I mean, because then I guess then again you get into the constitutionality of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, our constitutional system is set up that way to give priority to Congress and the state legislatures to do this. And the state legislatures are the first sort of avenue of where we're going down the road for drawing these districts. At various times, I might have said, yeah, it would make sense to have a stronger federal role, but you need to then trust that the federal government is going to do it in a fair way also. And I think what we're seeing now, where President Trump is pushing to get the Republican states to so usually, let me back up for a second. We're drawing the congressional districts after the census. So every 10 years, the census comes out and says, here's the population. Now draw the districts so that the districts have equal population. And so we go through a process of doing that. That process is rife with gerrymandering on both sides, political sides at the time. But at the very least, it happens every 10 years and things change. Now Trump is at Texas and other states to say, no, I want even more gerrymandering so that we can get more seats that don't match the population of that state. So go back, reopen the maps and do it again, even though we're not in the middle of that 10-year census. We're in the middle of the 10-year census period and not at the time when we should be drawing those maps. which now is leading blue states like California to say, okay, if you're going to do that, Texas, now we're going to start and gerrymander our maps. And I understand that tit for tat move from a political self-interest, but I think it's destructive to our democracy when we're just having constant battles over these lines of the parties trying to maximize their seats instead of having a fair system that really tries to accurately represent where the voters are. So a system where if it's 52% Republican, 48% Democrat is what the vote looks like, Congress should fairly represent that dynamic. Or if there's a third party that gets 10%, that should be represented as an ideal. And what the gerrymandering does is completely throws that out the window, where you could have a party that's getting 45% of the vote, but 55, 60% of the seats in a way that doesn't represent the American people. And I do think it is a problem. It doesn't align with democratic principles, and I think further erodes confidence in the democratic system.
That's interesting. And I almost feel like the whole census aspect also presents a lot of problems because, I mean, I'd be surprised if people were honest about filling out the census forms, Like, I mean, half the time, I can't imagine people would actually fill that out. I mean, I feel like there's
There are
probably a lot of
undercounts. I mean,
discrepancies.
it
Yeah.
can be an issue. There are undercounts, maybe underreporting, but it at least is something that gives some objective starting point for them to do the best they can. But for sure, there are districts where the population isn't equal because you didn't get the reporting of the responses to the census.
Yeah.
But one
Professor,
interesting side note on that is you do see it's in the state's interest to make sure they have high responses because the number of seats you have in Congress depends on your population. So if you get that underreporting, you might get one less seat in Congress than you would have otherwise. So the states do at least make an effort. I mean, again, it's not perfect, but they do have an incentive to try to get an accurate representation of their population.
Yeah.
Professor, do you have one election law issue that you wish that more people knew about or cared about?
Well, I think that the partisan gerrymandering, in my mind, is one of the biggest problems with our democracy. I will add one more that is sort of timely and coming right now. Is we've been talking about the decentralization. Now states and local governments generally are running the elections. We now have an executive order from President Trump on elections that is really asserting broad federal, not just federal, but federal executive control over the elections. That raises a new issue of what is the role of the president here and what is going to happen. And we haven't, it's gotten some press, but is a little bit under the radar compared to, some of the other newsworthy things that have happened. And it is something worth keeping an eye on, that, Trump issued an executive order saying we're requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, which is interesting because it's not at all clear that the president has the authority to do that. But also, what does that mean? Does everyone, to register to vote, you need a passport now to show you're a citizen? Not everyone has a passport. So there are lots of problems from just an access to the ballot, aside from the sort of separation of powers issue of whether the president has that authority. And the same executive order required a bunch of states to hand over their voter rolls to the federal government, purportedly relating to some immigration issues for which the federal government does have control. But it is unclear exactly how that data, those voter rolls from the states, are going to be used. So that's an open question worth keeping an eye on as we head into the midterms. And then a small issue that's in the executive order, maybe not a small one. I mean, to election law nerds, it's a big one. But we're talking about mail ballots. Different states handle it differently of when the mail ballot needs to be in. So some states say you can vote by mail, but that ballot needs to arrive by election day. Other states say it just needs to be postmarked by election day and arrive within, say, 2 or 3 days to be counted. The Trump executive order wants an election day receipt rule, meaning all ballots need to be received by election day for mail ballots across the board. And there have been some debates about that. Now, I mean, from a sort of pure partisan perspective, why does Trump want that? Because he thinks there'll be more Democratic votes that are trickling in late. But it doesn't mean there aren't good reasons to not have all the ballots in by election day, or good reasons to have the postmark rule. But that is something election law nerds do talk about. But the main thing is we have this executive order out there asserting some sort of asserting, I'd say, greater federal oversight than we've seen, or at least new ways of federal oversight that we've seen. And so it's just something worth keeping an eye on how that's going to play out, of the role of the federal executive here in the elections, particularly as we approach next year's midterms.
So, real quick, historically, have we ever seen the executive try to exert control over elections like this, or is this administration like the first one to try to do this?
Yeah,
That's a good one.
it's pretty unique. The Constitution gives the role to the state legislatures and to Congress, and we haven't seen, aside from, say, a Department of Justice that is enforcing different conceptions of voting rights, we've seen differences there. Different administrations prioritize uh, different concepts within voting rights, but simply an executive order adding new requirements to register to vote, we've never seen. An executive order saying, you have to have an election day receipt rule, we've never seen that. Could Congress pass a law making that the rule for all federal elections? Absolutely, it could. But for a president to do that in executive order, we've never seen. And then there's this question of, it's related to, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but the sort of Doge data gathering that's happened. What exactly does the federal government want with all of this voter roll data? It might just be related to immigration, but is it related to some election law issues as well? And is there some plan there? We don't know. But it is a big open question mark. Now, parts of that executive order have been enjoined in federal court, but that litigation is not done yet, and there'll still be ripple effects, and a lot remains to be seen over how that will play out.
Wow. It'd be an exciting year. Lots of do you think so? We'll probably see a lot of Supreme Court cases pop up because of this.
Yeah, I mean, every election now. Usually, it's the presidential elections that we see the Supreme Court cases. Now, a lot of the Supreme Court cases in an election year are done on what's called the shadow docket or emergency docket, where we don't get a full opinion, but we just get a short order from the court saying what's going to happen, because it's so fast moving. I think we will, if the Supreme Court takes up this Voting Rights Act issue, we will for sure get a full opinion from the court there. But in an election year, there can be a ton of litigation around these sorts of rules before the election, let alone if there's any sort of post-election litigation on recounts and those sorts of disputes. But before we can see that litigation, and a lot of times you get Supreme Court orders that are short, not full opinions, just saying, okay, no, in this state, the lower court overreached and shouldn't have enjoined this or that. And you see orders like that. And usually that volume spikes, at least usually. In the past several presidential election cycles, we've seen a high volume of Supreme Court orders there. Given the attention to this or next year's midterm elections, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a high volume of litigation there as well. And similarly, some Supreme Court orders coming down in addition to whatever else that they might be ruling down from Voting Rights Act cases.
Wow. That's exciting stuff. Well, what advice do you have for students who also want to be election law nerds? I mean, because it seems like such a niche topic to get into. Like, I just don't even know, like, as a student, like, how you would get into it. Like, it's so fascinating.
Yeah. Well, so I would think about how you might want to practice. And there definitely are options, even, outside of Washington, D.C., here in Minnesota, for example. So one, as I said, the state and local governments, they implement the elections. So there is the Secretary of State's office in Minnesota there. That's the state office in charge of elections. Now they're not a huge hire. It's a small office. There's general counsel there, but the Attorney General's office represents them. And there is a group within the Attorney General's office, or at least one attorney, who represents the Secretary of State and specializes in election law. So those are options at sort of the state level. You can also go work for the city or county that implements elections, and there will be attorneys for sure in those divisions at Ramsey County, Minneapolis, that work with implementing the elections at a local level. There are also law firms in town that represent the political parties. So There's sort of known law firms that'll represent the Democrats or Republicans and doing different work. And you could go to work at that firm and have a practice that is maybe largely not election law, but still consists of some election law. And then, of course, there are advocacy groups like the League of Women Voters and others that do a lot of election law work. And you can get involved, ACLU, NAACP, other groups that are doing voting work that you can get involved with in different ways as a law student or as a lawyer.
That's awesome. Well, we can't thank you enough for coming on the show and talking to us about this today. This was really great. I think this gives students just a great background into it, about some of the issues that we're going to see. It's so timely because filing, I think, for candidates starts, I think, for a lot of candidates in January. So this will be a good reminder for students to read up on the topic. And so thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Mirasam. And thank you for everyone for tuning in to the Mitchell-Hamline School of Law Journal of Public Policy and Practice podcast. We hope this episode sparked your curiosity and deepened your understanding of the legal and policy challenges we face, and we hope you tune in next time.